Well, it was about 20 years too late, because at the time I would have loved to get into jazz. When I was 15, the male fraternity had it sewn up. It was their territory. So I finally got into jazz through my late husband's reputation as a double bass player. And from then on, I haven't looked back. But Brisbane at the particular time when I was 15 to 25 didn't include women. The perception was that women couldn't play jazz.
Well, I guess it really crept up on me. My guess is around about the late 40s, around about 48 or 49, I suddenly became aware that there was music on the radio different to what I was normally hearing, I suppose. It just sounded different, and I sort of asked questions about that or hoped I'd hear it again.
It wasn't a question of what musicians were I playing with. I suppose it may sound a little conceited. It's more which musicians were playing with me, because I was actually organising. I'd organised the Pacific Jazzmen, and it was a regular band. We had Bruce on trumpet, my friend Peter Rex, who was from New Zealand, on trombone, and then he was replaced by Harley Axford, who later on became quite popular with a group of his that he organised at one of the colleges called SCAT. They toured all around the place. Percy Cram was on piano, Pat Roach on guitar, Denny on bass, and Ray Moore on drums. And basically we kept that line-up going for a few years.
Well, actually, I never mentioned the Brisbane Jazz Club Big Band, but actually that was started, I think it was in 73 or 74 by Tony Ashby. And they had quite a lot of people through there over the years, but that band is still going now, which is a long time. They've varied the name occasionally, not very much, but I think it's the Brisbane Big Band at the moment.
I was very lucky to work with a larger group of traditional jazz musicians, and that included Australia's greatest trumpet player, Bob Bernard. And that was a big learning experience, because I had never listened to or was interested in that kind of jazz. My ears were attuned to what was known as jazz trio. That's piano, double bass and drums. So I formed my own trio and went on to record, and that sound became my voice. And also I had a lot of experience, I gained a lot of experience early in my jazz career with backing other artists, like other instruments and jazz singers. So I had those two strengths, if you like, and that's been my pathway ever since.
My formative years here in Brisbane, the guys that really influenced me whilst I was doing some study were John Rogers, Ken Eadie, Jonathan Diamond. Those guys were massive influences for me, actually, very big, yeah. And I would dare to suggest that those guys actually influenced the Brisbane jazz scene as a whole, yeah, and contributed to the scene today in that there's some quite unique jazz bands getting around with, you could say, that have direct influences from those three men, yeah.
I suppose that those early records that I heard would have all been American, with a little bit of sprinkling of probably British stuff. But mostly it was, I started to hear about Bob Crosby and the Bobcats. He was Bing Crosby's younger brother who had a jazz band. Our own Australian Graham Bell, who's about to turn 93 or something now, suddenly I heard his records. Occasionally something would filter through from England, and what was sort of happening was around the world there was a revival going on of this really early type of jazz. I mean, if any form of jazz was popular when I was a kid growing up, it was swing. Benny Goodman, Harry James, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, that sort of stuff, big band stuff, which didn't really appeal to me very much. But when I heard this other stuff, which turned out to be young people playing old jazz, that switched me on.
That's where the heritage lies, to listen to the great American musicians, and for me it was those trio pianists that I mentioned before, and learning and growing through listening to their recordings. And that's where jazz was born in America. So you have to go to the pinnacle of where the art form is to be able to learn from it.
You can't explain it, but when you hear it, you say, that's it. From my point of view, it was the most original form of, shall we say, traditional jazz, in as much that those bands that I spoke about, the Johnsons, the Bells and the Dalwitzes, they played a lot of their own compositions. They could play the standards, but they played a lot of the compositions because of their own compositions.
You know, when I hear Bernie McGann, when I hear Mark Simmons, even when I hear, you know, someone like Dale Barlow, their sound is Australian, and I'd sort of, with that, I would suggest their tone, their compositions, the way they use instrumentation, to me, sounds very Australian as opposed to, say, sounding European or that ECM European kind of sound, and it sounds very different to American sounding jazz as well.
Well, we called ourselves in those days, our style is what is now referred to as trad or traditional jazz. We called it Dixieland, which was basically based on the sort of the original jazz that had started started in about 1900 in New Orleans. It got popularised by 1920 with the end of the First World War. You've heard of the flapper era, where all the, you know, it's almost, people were condemned for this terrible music, but the whole rock and roll story sort of all over again, all the moral arguments as to why this would be a problem. But nevertheless, sort of, so people like my parents grew up in a sort of that era, the so-called jazz age era, you know, of the 20s, which often really wasn't jazz. It was just, you know, danceable music. But getting back to your point, we were playing like the people trying to play like the people in the 20s did, like Louis Armstrong and Bix Beiderbecke and the famous people from that era, not like the Glenn Millers and the Benny Goodmans and people like that. And this was a movement. I think it was something of a rebellion in a way, because the swing music of the 30s had become a bit stereotyped and a bit square. And suddenly, when this revival started, it sort of swept the world in.
Well, I played at a crowd called, we played at a crowd called, a band called the Kit Kat at one time. And then there was another crowd, I played with a crowd called the Rhythm Rascals. But the main venues in the town were, there was a place called the Leader Hall in Ann Street, and there was the Trocadero. The Trocadero was the main dance place in Brisbane. And where the museum is now, there was a big dance place there called the Blue Moon. That was sort of number two in Brisbane.
Oh, that was very interesting, because two hoteliers sponsored me in a way that I could never have dreamed. Gary Balkin, who owned the Melbourne Hotel and then Bonaparte's Hotel and then the two Kookaburra Queens, and Michael Drum, who owned the Caxton Hotel. So I worked first with a trio for Gary at both his hotels, and then at the Caxton Hotel from about 1985, my trio was there, and we had an enormous following, so much so that Michael Drum sponsored financially our very first recording, which was live at the Caxton. It was played upstairs in a room like this with a select audience of 20 or 30 people. And so that was a huge breakthrough in our profile. And also a doctor named Milam Hayes had a cellar club, or a jazz club called the Cellar Club, where I was able to play in 5 different styles each week and play, you know, with all different musicians and learn a lot about different styles, ranging from bebop to cool jazz to trad jazz. So I was very, very lucky, and along with that, my trio was working in the top hotels and venues in Brisbane. We played for royalty. I played for festivals like the now defunct Warana Festival, And there were many, many opportunities to get good exposure and have fun, which is the main purpose of playing jazz.
Well, the band started here in '94, I think, which is a long time, isn't it, when you think about it? There's been a history of jazz in this pub since about 1949, I think. A famous jazz piano player, Graham Bell, came up here in 1949, and various bands have played here. In fact, it used to be called Storyville. If you know anything about jazz history, the jazz part of the pub was called Storyville, which of course was a suburb of New Orleans where jazz actually started. So it had a double, it seemed like a good name at the time. And so there's been a real history of jazz here for a long time.
Jazz is, to me, getting very much close to where Sydney was, say, 25 years ago. 6 to 10 years ago, we couldn't bring an interstate or an international jazz musician to Australia, or to Brisbane, should I say, and put them with the average rhythm section. They just weren't up to the standard. Now, we have some excellent young musicians and we have some great rhythm sections. So there's been a tremendous growth in the last, particularly last 6 years or so.
Well, I suppose in a sense we saw it decline. It was fairly short-lived. It still goes on, but again it's in much more specialised. I mean, there are jazz festivals and things. It's not the popular music of the day. For a brief period, I mean, jazz in its whole history, when the people in America discovered it, that when the white people sort of discovered that this was exciting music to dance to in, say, the 20s, it did so until finally someone says, no, those bands are a bit small, let's have bigger bands, bigger and better. The promoters get in and they change the situation. It becomes a commercial thing more than just an entertainment thing. I mean, they're linked. And then people get a bit weary of that particular sound and a new sound comes along. So in the jazz sense, the jazz of the 20s sort of melded into the big band swing era of the 30s. After the war, those big bands, which would have, 25 players in them, 15 to 25 players, they got too expensive to sort of take around the country. So that was they always talk about the end of the big band era. But meanwhile, as I said before, coinciding that, there was this sort of revolution in a sense. People wanted to sort of get back to something different, and this so-called, what people now refer to as traditional jazz, because it is the earliest type, had this, well, I'd say about a 10 to 15 year run if you take the world scene. I'm not talking about the Brisbane scene. Ours was about a 3-year run. But then there were other people followed us, but none of them seemed to sort of grab the imagination that we did. I suppose in a sense we were the first. But I'm not saying we were the first people to play jazz in Brisbane. I'm saying of that type.
Breakthroughs came when jazz education in schools meant that young women could decide to play drums or trombone is thought to be ungainly for women. Putting a sax into your mouth, you couldn't smile and look glamorous. And double bass is a big bulky instrument, so are drums. Trumpet, you have to form an embouchure, and that was supposed to be ungainly for women. So now young women can take their part and look forward to a productive and satisfying career without even having to have a real job. I mean, some of them might teach and work in orchestras, which is called doubling, so they play several instruments, but they really have an opportunity to have a full-blown career in the jazz idiom now.
I love the fact that you can express yourself freely within jazz. And in having said that, I love the fact that it's got this incredible tradition along with it as well. So on one hand, you've got an extremely expressive, free form of music, but it also has this tradition associated with it that needs to be explored in order to be able to express yourself freely. So in a way, I love the fact that it's freedom, but within a confined experience.